The envelope was already sealed when they handed it to me. My brother didn't even look up from his phone. That was the moment I understood that grief for some people is just an inconvenience between them and what they want. My grandmother passed on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks after her 81st birthday. She died quietly in the bedroom she'd slept in for 47 years, the lake visible through the window, her hand in mine. I had been staying with her for the last 8 months. I had taken a leave of absence from my job, driven 14 hours from Phoenix to her house in northern Wisconsin, and moved into the small guest room at the end of the hall, because she asked me to, and because there was no version of me that could have said no to her. My brother flew in the morning of the funeral. His wife arrived the same afternoon. They stayed at a hotel in town. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because it would be easy to make them into simple villains and leave it at that. But the truth is more complicated and, honestly, more sad. My brother is not cruel by nature. He's just a person who decided long ago that comfort mattered more than effort, a decision that compounded for 30 years. His wife is sharper, more deliberate. She notices things, calculates. If he forgot to call our grandmother on her birthday, she sent a card signed with both their names. I noticed things too. I just noticed different things. Our grandmother, whom I called Gran since I was 3, was a retired thoracic surgeon. She had practiced for 34 years at the same hospital in Milwaukee, trained dozens of residents, published research I couldn't begin to understand, and retired at 72 only because her hands had started to betray her. Above all else, she understood when a chapter was finished. She moved to the lake house full-time after that. She read, she gardened, she kept meticulous journals in handwriting that looked like something out of a different century. She never complained. Even at the end, when pain was bad and medication made her foggy, when she sometimes forgot the day, she never said why me or this isn't fair. She just looked at the lake. About 2 months before she died, I asked her how she stayed so calm. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Because I already know how this story ends, sweetheart. The only question I'm still curious about is who you're going to be after." I didn't fully understand that until later. The estate attorney, Mr. Calloway, was a careful man, methodical in the way people become after decades of watching families fall apart over dining room furniture. He had handled my grandmother's affairs for nearly 20 years. He called the day after the funeral and asked if we could all meet at the house on Friday morning. My brother and his wife drove over from the hotel. I made coffee. Nobody talked much. The morning light came in flat and gray off the lake. The house felt different already, not empty exactly, but rearranged somehow, like all the air had shifted. Mr. Calloway sat at the dining room table and set a folder in front of him. He explained that my grandmother's estate included the lake house and its full contents, a brokerage account, a smaller savings account, and a trust established 12 years earlier. He read through the document steadily, without drama. The brokerage account and savings, worth a little over $200,000, were to be divided equally between my brother and me. The trust, which held the lake house and its surrounding 11 acres, was different. The house had been appraised the previous year at $9.4 million. My brother's wife sat up slightly in her chair. Mr. Calloway explained that my grandmother had made my brother the primary beneficiary of the trust, conditional on maintaining the property, paying taxes, and not selling for at least 5 years unless both heirs agreed. My brother nodded. His wife was already scanning the room with a different attention than before. Mr. Calloway closed the folder and asked if there were any questions. There were none. He packed his things, shook hands, and left. My brother waited until the car was out of the driveway. Then he turned to me and said they'd need me out by Sunday. I looked at him for a moment, thinking I'd misheard. "I'm sorry. We're going to want to go through things," he said. "Start figuring out what to do with the place. It'll just be easier if you're not here." His wife was looking out the window at the lake. I said, "Gran died 4 days ago." He said he knew that. He said it wasn't personal. I could take whatever I wanted from the guest room, and they'd donate the rest of Gran's clothes to charity once they'd gone through them. He said this the way you'd say, "We'll figure out the recycling situation." I stood there in my grandmother's kitchen, in the house I had lived in for 8 months, the house where I held her hand while she died, and I felt the floor do something very strange beneath me. Not fall, more like dissolve, like I was suddenly standing on something that had no intention of holding my weight. I said, "She asked me to be here." He said, "I know, and you were. It mattered. But she's gone now, and this is our house." His wife finally turned from the window. She said gently, "The way you talk to someone you've already decided doesn't matter. We just need some time and space to process. You understand?" I understood something. I'm not sure it was what she meant. I went to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands on my knees, and breathed for a while. Out the small window, I could see the edge of the dock, the same dock where Gran had taught me to fish when I was 7, where we had sat every summer evening for as long as I could remember, watching the water go dark. I packed what was mine. It didn't take long. 8 months of living carefully in someone else's space means you never spread out too much. I took my clothes, my books, the small framed photograph of Gran and me from the nightstand, and the letters she had written me over the years, which I had kept in a shoebox since college. I did not take the journals. They were hers. They belonged to the house. My brother carried one of my bags to my car. He seemed relieved. He said we'd talk soon. He said family was important. I drove to a motel in town. I sat on the bed and looked at the popcorn ceiling and thought about having given up my apartment, my job, and 8 months of my life, and that the last thing I had done before leaving the house was wash the coffee cups from that morning, because I didn't want to leave them in the sink. I called my closest friend. She answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting, which is the only thing anyone can really do in those moments. When I finished, she said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "I didn't know." She said, "Okay, that's allowed." I stayed in the motel for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, my phone rang. It was Mr. Calloway. He asked how I was doing. Then he paused and said, "I have a question I need to ask you. Did your brother read the complete trust document? All of it?" I said, "I didn't know." He had been handed a copy at the meeting. I assumed he had. Mr. Calloway was quiet for a moment. He said, "I ask because the document has 2 sections. The first governs the primary transfer of the property, which I read at our meeting. The second section is a conditional addendum. It's only 4 pages, but it's rather important. The reason I didn't read it aloud on Friday is that it requires a 60-day observation period to have elapsed before it becomes active." He paused again. "That period began the day your grandmother passed. I sent your brother a certified letter explaining this 2 days ago. I want to make sure you were also made aware." I sat up. He said, "I think you should come to my office, Miss Hartley. There are some things in that addendum that concern you directly." I drove to his office that afternoon. He had the document open on his desk and a second chair pulled up, which I took to mean he'd been expecting me to take this seriously. The addendum, he explained, was something my grandmother had added to the trust 3 years ago, about a year after my grandfather died. She had been thinking, Mr. Calloway said about what she'd seen over decades in hospitals, in courtrooms, in families. She told him she had watched too many people show their real character only after a loss, when they thought no one was paying attention anymore. So she had built a mechanism. The addendum stated that for a period of 60 days following her death, the behavior of the beneficiary toward other family members, specifically toward me, would be observed and documented. Mr. Calloway himself was the designated observer, authorized to collect any relevant communications, speak with witnesses, and review any documented evidence of conduct. At the end of 60 days, he would prepare a report. If the primary beneficiary had during that period taken any action that constituted willful exclusion, financial coercion, or deliberate harm toward the secondary heir defined as the grandchild who provided primary caregiving in the final year of the testator's life, then the trust's controlling interest would transfer to me. I read that paragraph 3 times. "Mr. Calloway said, your grandmother was a very precise woman." I said, "She really was." He explained that I had nothing to do and nothing to prove. The burden was not on me. He had already begun documenting. He had the certified letter he'd sent my brother, his own notes from Friday's meeting, and he said carefully that if there was anything else I thought he should be aware of, any written communication, any witnesses to what had happened at the house, I was welcome to share it. I thought about the text message my brother sent me Saturday morning, confirming Sunday as my move-out date. I thought about the voicemail his wife left me 2 days later, cheerful and brisk, asking if I'd gotten settled and mentioning they were already thinking about some renovations. I pulled out my phone. I spent the next 53 days living in a short-term rental I found through a friend of a friend. It was a small 1-bedroom above a hardware store in a town about 20 minutes from the lake. The floorboards creaked. The bathroom faucet dripped. I slept better than I had in years. I went back to work remotely. I cooked. I called my friend most evenings. I went to the lake sometimes and sat on the public beach access down the road, watching the water. I did not drive past my grandmother's house. I thought about her constantly, but not in the sharp way grief usually cuts. More like she was present in the way someone is present when they've changed the way you see something permanently. I thought about what she had said. The only question I'm still curious about is who you're going to be after. My brother called once, about 3 weeks in. He said he hoped I was doing well, that he wanted to stay in touch, that family was important. I thanked him for calling. We spoke for about 6 minutes. He did not ask where I was living. He did not ask how I was managing financially. He mentioned that they'd started talking to a contractor about opening up the kitchen layout. I said that sounded nice. I did not tell him about the addendum. Mr. Calloway had advised me I was under no obligation to, and that it would be cleaner for the process if I didn't. On day 61, Mr. Calloway called and asked me to come in. He had a thick folder on the desk this time. He walked me through it methodically, the way he did everything. He had the text messages I'd provided. He had the voicemail transcript. He had a signed statement from the realtor my brother contacted on day 9 days after the funeral, to inquire about listing the property, a direct violation of the 5-year non-sale condition in the primary trust document. He had his own contemporaneous notes from every communication with my brother's household over those 60 days. He said the report was unambiguous. He said the conditional addendum had been triggered. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. Miss Hartley, the trust now transfers to you, the lake house, the 11 acres, everything in it. There are some administrative steps, but effectively, it's yours. Your grandmother knew what she was doing. I looked at the folder. I looked at the window outside. It was a bright May morning, the kind that makes Wisconsin look like a painting. I said, "What happens to my brother?" Mr. Calloway said the forfeiture clause was clear. My brother would receive his half of the brokerage and savings accounts as originally specified, just over $100,000. He would have no claim on the property. I was quiet for a long time. Here is what I did not do. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because people expect a moment like this to feel like winning, like a door slamming in the right direction. But what I felt was mostly tired and sad, very aware that my grandmother was still gone and that no house, no matter what it was worth, would change that. What I felt underneath all of it was her. I thought about what she had built into that document. Not a trap, not a punishment, but a test. A question she was still asking from wherever she was: who are you going to be when it costs you something? And I thought about the fact that she had trusted me to answer it correctly before she even knew what the question would look like in practice. I called my brother that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I told him about the addendum. I explained what it meant. I gave him time to process, which he used mostly to be very quiet, and then to say, "She did this on purpose." I said, "I think she did almost everything on purpose." He said some other things. His wife said some things in the background that I could half hear. I let him say them. When he was finished, I said, "I'm not calling to argue or to make you feel a certain way. I'm calling because you're my brother, and I wanted you to hear this from me." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Then I made dinner and ate it standing up at the kitchen window of my little rental, watching the streetlights come on over the hardware store parking lot below. Moving back into the lake house took one afternoon. I hadn't owned enough things to make it complicated. The hardest part was walking back into her bedroom. The journals were still on the shelves where she'd kept them, 37 volumes in matching green covers going back to 1978. I didn't open them that day. I just sat in the chair by the window, looked at them, and felt the particular weight of being trusted with something irreplaceable. I found a note she had left for me. Mr. Calloway had mentioned there might be one tucked into the addendum paperwork. It was handwritten, 2 paragraphs, in handwriting that looked like a different century. She wrote that she hoped I wasn't angry with her for the complexity of it all. She wrote that she had spent her career watching people's best and worst selves come out in extremity, and that she had simply wanted to know, needed to know. She said that whatever she left behind would end up in the hands of someone who could hold it without being changed by it in the wrong direction. She wrote at the end, "You were always the one who stayed, not because I asked you to, but because you couldn't imagine doing otherwise. That is the only inheritance that matters. Everything else is just property. I read that twice. Then I folded it and put it in the shoebox with the other letters. In the months that followed, I made some decisions. I kept my remote work situation and stayed at the lake full-time, at least through the end of the year. I had a ramp installed on the side of the dock, the one my grandmother had wanted for 2 years but kept putting off because it felt like finishing something. I hired a local woman to help me go through the house room by room, cataloging everything carefully, photographing what needed to be photographed, donating what could be donated. I also had a conversation with Mr. Calloway about the medical equipment in the study. My grandmother had kept a small collection of historical surgical instruments that she'd gathered over her career. He connected me with a medical history archivist at the University of Wisconsin who was very interested. It felt like the right place for them. She would have liked that. My brother contacted me again in September, a letter this time, which surprised me. Handwritten, which surprised me more. It was short, half a page, and it said, without quite saying it, that he was sorry. He didn't use the word. He said he had been thinking about Gran a lot, about Sunday, and that he hadn't handled things well. He said he hoped I was doing okay at the lake. I wrote back, longer than he had written. I told him I was okay. I told him about the ramp on the dock, the archivist, and the way the lake looked in September. I told him I'd found a photograph of the two of us at the house, must have been 1998, sitting on that same dock with Gran between us. I said I was going to have it framed. I didn't tell him I'd already cried over that photograph twice. That felt like something I could keep for myself. He wrote back once more. Shorter. He said thank you. He said he'd like to visit sometime if that was okay. I said it was okay. I meant it mostly. What I've learned, the way you learn things that cost you something slowly, incompletely, with revisions, is that the people who leave us don't just leave their belongings, or their money, or even their memories. They leave the shape of their thinking, the architecture of how they moved through the world. And if we're paying attention, if we're actually listening to what they were doing all those years while we were just being around them, we inherit something that can't be appraised, contested, or transferred by any legal document. My grandmother was a surgeon. She understood better than most that you could hold something precious and fragile in your hands without flinching. That steadiness under pressure was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway. She spent 81 years being that kind of person. She spent her last 8 months teaching me without once announcing that's what she was doing, how to do the same. The lake is frozen now. I can see it from the desk where I'm writing this, solid and white and very still, the way it gets in January up here, when the cold comes hard from the northwest and everything goes quiet. There's a quote from one of her early journals that I found when I finally started reading them. She wrote it the year she finished her residency, 1970. The goal is not to be unshaken. The goal is to remain yourself while the shaking happens. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what it means to stay yourself when circumstances are doing everything they can to make you into something smaller, harder, or meaner. About the fact that my grandmother apparently started thinking about that question in 1970 and was still thinking about it in the addendum she added to her trust document in 2021, 51 years later. Some people spend their whole lives asking the same question in different forms. I think that's what it looks like to take something seriously. She asked me who I was going to be after. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm figuring it out in her house, at her desk, looking out at her lake. And I think she'd say, that's a pretty good place to start. If this story resonates with you, consider leaving a comment, liking, and subscribing for more stories that explore the human experience through family, legacy, and the moments that truly matter.